Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Azure series. I hope you had a wonderful day and you're happy to join us. It's been a terrible weather here in UK, but hopefully you had a wonderful weather. David, so what do you think? Is it a good weather for you?
Yeah, so it's but you know what, Sakofi, we're sort of like used to this already, right? It's
Yeah,
like we've had all kind. I mean, that's not the way it goes in UK. It's all kinds of weather within a single day. You can have summer, winter, spring, autumn, all within a single day. It happens that way.
that's right.
So yeah.
We will actually wait a bit more to see if more people will actually join our session before we actually resume. But before this time, I hope you guys, if you did join us yesterday, we actually gave you a task to complete, which is the lab. Hope you guys managed to accomplish that task. For today's session, it's also going to be a great one. We are planning for a lab, but that will be more likely tomorrow, which will actually publish the lab out to our YouTube channel.
Yeah. So, Sakofi, I've got a quick question for you. Very interesting
Yeah.
question for you. So, like, anything that got you involved in Azure to begin with? So, you've been doing a lot of Azure studies for a while now, and even much more intense lately. And by the way, for others that are not aware, I'm not sure. It's sort of like I'm getting like some feedback, but I'm not sure. Yeah, but it's sort of like you recently passed your Azure Architect certification exam, right, Sakofi?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. Yeah, I'm quite
So,
excited for that. Yeah.
So, any reason why you decided to do that? So, for maybe people that are joining, that are thinking, is there any real benefit for me to do this? So, is there any reason, any motivating factor for you that you decided to go do that?
Well, it's all about the industry. At the moment, if you watch the industry, it seems that a lot of companies are actually going that direction. So having that skill is really essential. And where I work at the moment, that seems to be the case. There's a lot of, talks about services being deployed in the cloud. And we will support customers in that sort of, environment. So having the knowledge is really good and it's future proof for your careers, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. And another question that I have to ask you on behalf of everyone else that's watching is, so when you did your preparation for the certification exam, so how did you prepare for that? Was it books, was it videos, was it studying with, others? How did you do that preparation?
Well, I prefer video. Visualization is essential for me to understand, and also practice labs is quite essential. So with the videos that I watched was extremely good, and I was able to pass. And with the help of Sir David as well, because many times I refer back to Sir David, and he helped me a lot in terms of my preparation and passing. So whichever route you might take reading books or video. But at the moment, there's a lot of content out there on YouTube, on other platform, the education platform that are extremely good. So whichever avenue that you take is just definitely going to be good. But one thing you have to always remember is that the cloud environment, there's constant changes. So whatever you're doing, you need to make sure that you are looking into the latest materials. That's the most important thing.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so I can introduce sort of like what we have today. But first of all, let me remind our delegates that are watching us and that are joining us that if you're yet to join our meetup group, make sure you do so. So that's how you get notified of events that we're going to be setting up. So make sure you do join our meetup group. Also, we have an amazing LinkedIn group that's grown. So we have over 7,000 members. So if you do have any questions on any of the Azure certifications, you can just raise that with us and we'll be happy to help you out with that. So, and then we have like, of course, the YouTube channel, the Twitch channel, and also our Twitter account. So do ensure that you follow all of that.
Yeah.
And yep, sorry, Sakofi, when there's
Yeah.
something.
And one more thing, during our sessions, if you have any question that you want to ask, feel free to drop it in the comment section below, whether on YouTube or on Twitch. We will be able to see it and they answer you.
Okay. So what are we doing today? So here's what we're going to be doing today. So we already saw this. So I'll skip a bunch of these. So today will be about governance and compliance part one. And here's what we're looking to do today, Psychophy. So if I go over to this lesson, study objectives. So here's what we're going to be looking to do. We're going to be looking at subscriptions and account recap. So we just do a quick recap of Azure subscriptions, management groups, and just the Azure organization hierarchy. Then we'll go to talk about Azure policy. So that's what we're going to look to cover today. And then from tomorrow, we're going to extend that into role-based access control. And of course, Sakofi has an homework for you to do. So we're going to be discussing that.
Yeah.
Yep. So should we start, Sakofi? Are we good? Let's start?
Yeah, yeah, let's go. Let's
Awesome.
go. 5 minutes past time. Yeah, so let's
Yep.
go.
So today, let's start by looking at Azure subscriptions and accounts recap. And what we're talking about here is understanding the Azure organization structure. Now, if you remember, on the first day of this live study session, we told you that in order for you to be able to deploy anything to Azure, you need two main things. You need an Azure AD tenant and you need an Azure subscription. We mentioned that the Azure AD tenant is where your identities exist, your users, your groups, your service principals, your managed identities. If all of those don't make sense to you, just stay with us in this study series. By the end of this study series, they will make sense to you. So Azure AD is where your identities are stored. Azure subscription is where we have our resources, our actual services and our resources that we're deploying, they exist in the Azure subscription. And we also mentioned that there is a trust relationship between an Azure subscription and an Azure AD tenant. And I remember Sakofi asked me a question yesterday about can a subscription trust more than one Azure AD tenant? I'm not sure if you remember that question.
Yeah, I do. I
Yeah.
do.
So that was one question that we didn't answer yesterday. So let's go to
Yeah.
answer that question today, first of all, before we go on. So here's the answer to that question. An Azure subscription can have a trust relationship with only one Azure AD tenant.
Right.
Yeah,
So it can have one,
yeah,
but the tenant can have multiple subscription.
exactly.
Okay.
So I can go create another subscription right here, and I can go add another subscription, and my other subscription can be using that same Azure AD tenant. So in other words, what that means is I'm just centralizing my identity source. Is what
Right.
I'm doing.
Okay, so I have a question in regards to this then.
Yes.
Right. So linking to subscription to 180 tenant, right?
Yep.
Does it mean that the trust is probably transit, whereby if I create a resource in one subscription, then that subscription can easily be moved to the other subscription without any fuss.
So that's a very good and intelligent question, Sir Kofi. Very, very powerful question. So the answer to that is it depends.
Okay.
And one of the things that it depends on is what we're about to talk about today. So
Okay.
one of the things that we'll talk about today is something called management group. So because here's the issue, Sir Kofi. So I have an Azure AD tenant,
Yeah,
right? And I have an Azure subscription. That's what I started with, right?
that's right.
And then what happens is I begin to create more subscriptions. Then I have another subscription. Then all of a sudden I have 100 subscriptions or 1,000 subscriptions in my environment.
Is there any limit to that?
Not that I'm aware of. So
Okay.
there could be, but I'm not aware of like any limit in terms of the number of subscriptions that we're joining to an Azure AD tenant. But the pain point here is that it becomes difficult for me to manage these subscriptions individually,
That's
right? So it becomes very difficult for me to do that. So in order to simplify my management, what I can go to do is I can go to enable something called a root management group. I'll just call that management group here. So, but this is the root management group. And once I enable that, so essentially what happens is I'm going to have a root management group here, and all my subscriptions essentially falls under that root management group. I know that my drawing is all messed up here, so let me clean the screen. So I have a better diagram that I can show to you. So let's go to that other diagram. So
Okay.
here's to answer Sarkoph's a wonderful question. Here's what that looks like, Sarkophy. So again, I have my Azure AD tenant where I have my identities. And then if I go to enable the root management group, all other subscriptions that are linked to this Azure AD tenant are going to be under this root management group. And what that means is that there could be opportunity to move laterally across between them depending on how I've configured things. So that's sort of like the way that works. So once I enable
Okay.
the root management group, then I can have child management groups, and then I can begin to, so I can have another subscription that's linked to that same Azure AD tenant. That's part of that management group. I can have another subscription over here that's part of that management group. But essentially, if I give anyone permission at this root management group level, they have access to all the subscriptions that are linked to my Azure AD tenant.
Okay. So that means whatever you add to the root, the child will be able to inherit it.
Exactly.
Okay.
But this is not something that's enabled by default. So because here's I'll tell you like a little bit of history to this Sarkophy. So here's the history to that. So let's go back again with the slides and let's go to have a look at this. So because what happened in the past is every time you create a subscription, you have to manage it individually. But what happened was that here's what can go wrong in that scenario is that organizations began to create individual subscriptions and then they began to have many, right? So you
That's
start
right.
out with one subscription, then you have two, then you have three, then the DevOps group comes to you and then you have another one. Then the development group comes to you and then you have another one. Then they say we have another project here, then you have another one. And then it just becomes a pain to manage all of this individually.
Okay.
So, yeah. And because what happens also is that you have to configure your governance, your policy, and your role-based access control. You have to configure that individually per subscription. And that's very painful to do.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And because what could then happen there is so Sarkozy gives David permission to this subscription. And Sarkozy makes David an owner of this subscription. Now, an owner allows, oh, sorry, let's clear that up. So, owner allows David to be able to um, not only access all the resources and manage all the resources in that subscription, but it allows me to also add permission to other people.
Okay.
So,
So you said owner. Can you give a more description of what an owner is?
so that's someone that will delve into more details tomorrow. But what an owner is a role in Azure that has full control over a subscription.
Absolutely right.
And
Thank
full control means it can manage, it can do any configuration change, and it can also add permission to other people. So that's what full control means. So it's not just about, oh, I can make all the changes. It's I can make all the changes, but I can also add other people into that subscription and give them any permission that I want.
All
So
right.
that's owner. So it's essentially a very powerful role. So we'll talk about that when we talk about role-based access control tomorrow. So, but this is the pain, is that this is what organization had. So that is why Microsoft introduced the concept of management group to allow us to simplify that. And the whole idea, oh, sorry, you wanted to say something,
No,
Sakofi?
go for it.
Yeah. And the whole idea behind that is this, is that now with management group, we can have a structure like this, right? So where we have a root management group at the top, then we can create child management groups, and then we can group our subscriptions under that child management group. And then I can apply my policies and my governance at the child management group level, and that goes down to all the subscriptions within that management group.
Right.
Yeah. So what I'm going to show is how we can begin to use management group. So I'll go to my Azure environment here. So I do have an Azure subscription. So if I go over here and if I type in management group, what you notice is that it's not enabled by default. You can see that right now I'm just managing my subscriptions individually, right? So it's like, yeah, you're not using management groups yet. So, but however, if I begin to have multiple subscriptions, then I can say I want to start using management groups. So what I need to do is I can go to click on start using management groups. And what it's going to ask me to do is it's going to ask me to create a child management group. So it's going to create a root management group, but then it's going to create a child management group under that. So let's say I want to create a group management group for the subscriptions that will be managed by the DevOps team. So I'll just say DevOps Team management group, and I'll use that as the display also. And I'll click on submit. So it's only going to take a few moments to create, but once it's finished creating this coffee, that
Yeah.
is me enabling the root management group.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. And then when I enable that, essentially all the subscriptions under my Azure AD tenant will fall under that root management group.
So would that be automatic, or you have to manually add the subscriptions?
So they will automatically fall under the root. So the
Uh,
root is sort of the top of the hierarchy now, right? So all the subscriptions that you now create, if I go back to the slides now, all the subscriptions will fall under this root,
Okay.
right? However, what will happen is that so I'll have like the root management group. I can have a subscription on this level
Yeah.
that doesn't belong to any child management group, but then I can now go to start moving my subscriptions into child management groups as I go on.
Okay, I see.
Yeah. So that's sort of like how that works. So that will only take a few moments to create. So here you go, Sakofi. Can you see what it's done? It's created
Yeah.
the tenant root management group. And you see that it automatically added my one subscription under
Yeah.
that root management group. But under that subscription, it's also added the child management group that I created now.
I see.
Yeah. So if I wanted to move this subscription from the root management group and put it under this child management group, I can do that. So, in other words, let me go to see what I currently have. So, Kofi is I have this root management group, and this root management group has a child management group under it called the DevOps group. I'll just call it Dev. And under it, it has a subscription called, I'll just call this subscription one. I'll call this S1. So, what I want to do, Sakofi, is I want to move S1 from directly under the root management group. I want to move it under this child management group here. So that S1 will be here instead of being directly under the root.
Oh, I see.
So if I wanted to do that, what I'll do is I'll go to that child management group. I go under subscriptions, and then I can go to add subscription, and I can go to specify my subscription and move it and say, I'm moving you over here. And now after that is done, I'll have my subscription under this child management. There you go.
Wow.
Yeah. So there you go. So that's how that works. So how does this tie in with what we're discussing today, Sir Coffee? Because today we're actually going to start looking at how we can begin to govern our Azure subscriptions. So here's a trick, not a trick question, but it's a question for Sarkovi's level question. So what do you think is the main reason for cloud project failures? Why the number one reason why people that move things into the cloud, the project fails and they go, we have to move it back out of the cloud. What do you think is the number one reason?
I mean, if I look at it in the context of, let's say, governance, I believe on-prem most often was the system admin. He was the main guardrail who makes sure that everything that need to be deployed on their on-prem environment, he can look at it and determine whether it's something that is acceptable in their environment or not. But once you move to the cloud, I mean, essentially everyone can have access to it straight to the cloud. They don't actually have to go through a single person. I mean, I think probably some companies might do it that way, but ultimately the whole point is that you need your end users to be able to go directly to the cloud and deploy services. So I think one of the failures could be that if anyone goes there, they can create resources without any limitation, and that can affect budget. That can affect probably geo restrictions. For example, someone can deploy a virtual machine in a region that probably it might violate the company's GDPR.
Yeah.
So that might be the reason why. And also policy-wise, probably without any specific policy preventing people from doing certain tasks, they might obviously do whatever they like. So
I couldn't have said it any better myself, Sir Kofi. That's awesome. Because that's exactly what it is. So, for example, if I go over here, And so I'm currently using like a trial subscription. I'll show you like some sample, like let's say I want to go create a virtual machine in Azure. I'll just show you some sample virtual machine sizes that I can go create in this environment. And by the way, Sakofi, you're absolutely right. The number one reason for cloud project failures is budget. So people have this wrong assumption in their mind that moving to the cloud means saving costs. And in their mind, when they think of cost, they are thinking financial cost. They are not thinking management cost. They are thinking what this cost financially. However, what they've done by that is they've missed out some very important thing. Because here's the truth, Sakofi. You cannot get financial cost savings in the cloud without changing your behavior as an
Yeah.
organization.
Yeah.
So I'll give you an illustration. So let's go to see sizes of virtual machines that exist in Azure, and I'll just do like some crazy stuff. Let's go check like what sizes of virtual machines can we deploy in Azure. Like what's our coffee set? So let's do CPU. Let's say let's try to go for something that has like a very high number of CPU. Let's see. Uh, let's say filter this by CPU 416. Look at that, Sakofi. I can have a virtual machine size that has, so the size is not available, but look at that. It has 416 CPUs,
Wow.
11,400 gigs of RAM. How much is that going to cost me per month? 64, 64 grand per month, right? So I
Yeah.
actually have a very interesting story on this. So not personally, but one that I heard someone say. So I believe it was someone at Microsoft that said this. So he said, "Oh, one day he logged into the environment and he saw like a very powerful database service that was running in the Azure subscription, and I was like, whoa, that's a powerful database service. It must be hosting some really complex database workload that's going on." And then he logged in and had a look, and it was like, it's empty. Here is a database service that's costing literally tens of thousands in a month and it's empty. And then he had a look in the activity log to see who created this database service and went to speak to the engineer and went to the engineer and said, "Hey, I just noticed that there's a database running a Azure subscription, but it's empty." And the engineer was like, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, I did that. We have a project that will start in the next 2 weeks." I thought, why wait for 2 weeks? Spin it up. Let it start running. We'll get to it in 2 weeks. But that's the sort of behavior that people have on premises, right?
Yeah.
You go on premises, you don't feel anything. You go to your VMware cluster, your Hyper-V cluster, the resource is already there, it's paid for. You spin up that service and you just wait for the next 2 weeks. But if you transfer that behavior into the cloud environment, you're gonna get issues like the budgeting issues. Then whenever people see the budget, they're like, "Move this back on premises next week."
Right.
you know,
Yeah. Because it seems to be costing more than what they anticipated. Yeah.
Exactly. And that is where policy and governance comes in, which is what we are discussing today. So let's go back to the slides and let's go look at policy. So let's go look at some of the tools that we can use to implement governance in Azure. So the number one tool that we talk about today is a service called Azure Policy. And what we're going to be looking is we'll look at an overview of Azure Policy, policy definition, policy assignment, and policy evaluation. And this is Azure Policy in a way that you've not heard it before. So if you think that you understand Azure Policy, pay attention to what we're going to discuss here because you probably hear something that you've not learned before. And if you've learned everything, fine. However, I believe that you're going to learn something here that's a bit different. So, first of all, what's the definition of good cloud governance? So, a good cloud governance should try to enforce security and compliance while allowing the engineering teams to be able to have autonomy over their own resources. In other words, when we talk about cloud governance, we should not come to cloud governance with our on premises traditional mindset of locking everything down. Because if you lock everything down, you're essentially cheating your organization from getting the benefit of the cloud, which is agility. You have to be able to allow your engineering teams to have agility, which is they have autonomy over their own resources, while at the same time, like what Sarkofi said, you have to ensure that you're not going to allow them to do things that could put your organization in trouble. So, in other words, you build guardrails around them and you give them freedom, right? It's sort of like I'm not saying that developers and DevOps team are children. It's sort of like you build like a fence, right? And then you allow your children to play, in that area. That's sort of
Yeah.
what we're talking about. Because if
That's
you
what I
see,
do to my little boy now.
so what do you do? Do you sort of like so you sort of put him like in the room and then you go, go do your own thing?
Yeah.
Because if you try to hold him, right? Because what happens, Zakofi, that's actually a very good analogy. If you try to restrict him that much, then you'll be in pain and you'll be in pain also, right? You'll
That's right.
probably cry a lot and then you'll probably not have peace. So, and that's probably the way it works for many people, right? So many security people try to lock things down so much and then they have no peace because the developers keeps coming back to them all the time. Can I do this? Can I do this? Can I do this? Can I do this? Right? So nobody has peace. Developers can do what they want to do. They're doing shadow IT over there, and security people also have no peace because you're constantly responding to tickets. So that is where Azure policy comes in. But what is Azure policy? Here's a definition that you won't read about on Microsoft website. So this is David's definition, right? And anybody wants to guess who inspired Sir David with this definition, you guessed it right, Sir Kofi. so, so let's look at the definition of Azure policy. So Azure policy, it's a configuration assessment and enforcement tool. That's the simple definition. This is a tool that you can use to assess configuration and enforce configuration in your Azure environment. So it's sort of like group policy for the cloud, right? So that's what this is. So what can it do for us? We can use it to assess and enforce configuration for existing and new resource deployment. Now, Sarkozy said something earlier that was very interesting. Sarkozy said he's a visual person. I'm a visual person also. When I read words like this, I don't connect with it that much. So let me go translate what you're reading on the screen. Let's go translate that into something that will make more sense to you. So let's go see this. So here's how Azure policy work. So in this environment, Sarkofi, here's what I have. I have my Azure subscription, and my Azure subscription has 3 virtual machines. And the virtual machine have these sizes. So this has that size, that size, that size. So that's what I have. When we talk about Azure policy, one of the things that makes it powerful is that it's built into the control plane of Azure. The control plane of Azure is something called Azure Resource Manager. And when we say control plane, what we mean is that every create request, update request, all the CRUD request, right? Delete request has to go through this control plane. And the Azure policy engine that we're talking about is embedded right into that control plane. The advantage for this is that there is nothing that can bypass Azure policy because everything has to come through that control plane. And right within the control plane is where Azure policy sits. So let's go further. So what that means is if you're creating your resources using Azure Portal, you're creating using Azure PowerShell, you're creating using Azure CLI, everything you're doing has to go through Azure Resource Manager and has to go through Azure Policy. So here's how Azure Policy works. So we mentioned over here, we said it can assess and enforce configuration for existing resources and new resource deployment. So here's how it works. So Sarkofi, I go to my Azure environment and I create a policy, right? So that's embedded in the policy engine to say, I only want to allow virtual machine sizes of this size. So that's the only virtual machine size that I want to allow in my environment. I don't want any other virtual machine size in my environment apart from that. So once I implement this policy in my environment, what it's going to do is it's going to begin to assess my existing resources in Azure. That's what we mean by it can assess configuration for existing resources. So once I create that policy, it's going to assess the configuration of all my existing resources. And what it's going to do is it's going to begin to flag up to me and say, hey, this particular resource is compliant with that policy. This resource, because it's a different size from what is allowed, it's not compliant with that policy. This resource is not compliant with that policy.
Okay, so it's not going to auto delete them, but it's going to notify you or give you an alert.
Exactly. So it's not going to auto delete them. It's not going to break them. It's not going to stop them or break them. So for existing resources, it's not going to do that. All it's going to do is it's just going to alert you and let you know. So there are different, we'll talk about this later, but Azure policy has about 7 different effects that you can apply when you're creating the policy. So depending on the effect that you apply is what's going to determine what it's going to do. But to start with, most people will just have like an audit effect. Just show me what my current state of policy alignment is. So that's what you're going to start with.
Okay. So these are like user defined, or are they? I mean, are they templates on Azure environment that people can just use to implement certain policies?
Good question, Sir Kofi. So out of the box in Azure, there are hundreds of Azure policy, built-in policies, they call them, that exist that we can start with. So actually, if I go over to the Azure subscription here, so it's time to go back to the subscription. Let's go see what this looks like.
Yeah, before we go to that, we got one question. So I'm just going to bring it up on the screen.
Yes, please. Yes, that's fine.
Right, there you go. Would the policy allow them after alerting you? So,
okay. So I assume that Okoyemi is asking the question for new resources. So the behavior, just to answer that question very quickly, the behavior is different for existing resources versus new resources, right? So for existing resources, majority of the Azure policy effect, we just do an audit, right? Except you use like a policy, a modify effect, then it's going to look to modify. So, but for new resources that have been deployed, if you apply like a deny effect, is actually going to stop them from being able to deploy that resource. And I'll show you an example of that in a minute. So just be aware that, we're talking about, do you have existing resources? Are you trying to deploy a new resource, right? If I create a policy, for example, Sir Kofi, if I go to my Azure subscription and I go to under my Azure subscription and I go to scroll down and I go to under policies. So under policies over here, I can go to under policy definitions. And this helps to answer Sarkoph's question, which is, do I have to start from scratch? What you see is that there are hundreds of policies
okay,
that exist built in. So if I go to policy and you see loads of them, and you can filter them by category. So some of the policies are aligned with different types of resources. So if I want to see policies that have to do with Azure storage, I can scroll down to storage and select that. So here are some policies that have to do with Azure storage that I can start with. Yeah.
So you can target it by specific resource.
Exactly. And that's sort of like the thing. So yeah. So
and these are something that Microsoft continuously updates, I believe.
Yes, they do. So, and that's sort of like where to start from. Although I'll mention that there's a way to like get things even on a much more better front. So like services like the Palo Alto Prisma Cloud service does an amazing job of leveraging like policy configuration assessment to essentially help organizations to understand, the current posture, security and compliance posture of the environment. Yeah. But that's by the side. But yes, but this is sort of like the foundational place to start with.
Yeah, at the very top, I can see policy definition, initiative definition, export definition. So does it mean that you can actually import your own policy or from another source to this platform?
Yes, that's a very good question, Zakofi. And the answer to that is yes. So you can actually go modify this existing policy. So for example, let's pick a policy, for example, that says, let's go select all policies, and I'll just search for policy that has skill. And here is a policy that I can use to limit the skill of Azure storage that can be created, right? So if I take that policy, for example, and I click on that, right, you can see that I can duplicate it, I can export it, I can go view the definition. So if you actually go look at the policy definition behind the scene, it's just a JSON document. So that's what it is. It's a JSON document that defines, so we'll talk about this later. It's a JSON document that defines what configuration that we're going to look at and the effect that we're going to apply. So you can see the effects, right? So that's the effects that I was talking about. So that also helps to answer Opayemi's question. So for example, if I go to assign this policy, it's going to ask me to specify the effects that I want to apply if that is violated, right? So if I just go apply that to my subscription, so let's go do that. So if I apply that to my subscription over here, and I'm going to click select, so I'm going to apply that to my subscription, And essentially, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this to limit the type of storage accounts that can be created, right? And if I go to next, you can see the effect.
Okay.
So if I apply a deny effect, so to Okoyemi's question, it's going to deny any new resource that violates that policy is going to deny them from being able to be deployed. However, for existing resources, it's not going to stop them. It's just going to
Okay.
audit them. So yeah,
All right. I have a question on this one, right? So,
yes.
in your experience, in terms of creating these type of policies, I mean, for the first time, is it a good thing to do use an audit or go ahead and probably go with extreme action like deny?
So the way that you probably operationalize that is you start with an audit.
All
So
right.
you start with an audit, then you go to your different teams and you say, hey, team, you're not compliant with our organization policy. Can you fix these resources that are under your control? Right? You give them space to do that. But at the
Okay.
same time, so what you can do is you can go at it from two different angles. You apply an audit for existing resources and apply a deny for new resources. So essentially, you're stopping bad configuration from being created while at the same time you're looking at existing resources. Oh, I just saw something here that distracted me. We got Mr. Dara on the line. Whoa, that's amazing. Thanks very much for joining, Mr. Dara. So Sarkofi, if you don't know Mr. Dara, I think we should get to meet him. So
Yeah,
he's based in
definitely.
London, so he also has like a new baby like you. So based in London, and he's an amazing developer and DevOps person. So he's an awesome, awesome guy. So we should get to meet him in London at some point. So
Yeah,
that we're
definitely.
coming. We'll eat jollof rice. We'll eat all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
So, so get ready. So I can see a question by Ajay also. So
Let me
Ajay
bring it up
asks,
on the screen.
yep, awesome. So Ajay asked the question: is this default policy for individual category, or is it possible to amend as per need? So very good question. So you can amend it, Ajay. So you can go to modify that policy and do that. So for example, let's go back to where I started from. So I started with this policy. If I go to duplicate this definition, it allows me to go essentially clone that. Oh wow, Koyami is based in London also. Awesome. Lots of jollof rice and coffee we're going to be having.
Yeah.
So definition, location. So essentially, I'm cloning this policy, AGI. So when I clone this policy, I can go to modify this. So for example, where it's saying this, I can go to change that and say, I just change that to deny. So essentially, just go modify this however I want to do that. So I can modify an existing policy. So it allows me to do that. So let me quickly go back to assign this policy because I want to show you what that looks like. So I'll go ahead and assign that. So assign policy. And, Azure policy, we go into it in a lot more details. But what we'll do, Sarkofi, is when we get to the Azure Security Engineer study series,
Yeah.
right, we're going to go into Azure policy in more details. So I'll apply a denying effect, but remember that a denying effect behaves differently for existing resources than for new resources. Denying effect does not deny new resources; it's just going to audit new resources, but it's going to audit existing resources, but it's going to deny new resources. So, anyways, so allowed skill. If I say I only want to allow people to create a storage account that is standard GRS, so that's the only allowed option. And if I go to next, and if I go to create that and create. So once I've assigned this policy, Sarkofi, so if I go under assignments, I can see that this policy is now assigned to my subscription. And then what I'll do is I'll go to try to create a storage account resource. So I'm going to create a storage account resource that violates that policy. And you're going to see what that will look like for a new resource. So let's go to storage account. And when I create this resource, I'm going to select a locally redundant storage, which violates the policy that I specified just now. So come on. So resource group, let's create a new resource group of storage RG. Come on. Let's go back to storage RG, and that creates this resource. And storage account name, I'll just call this store 98676. Let's put that any location, that's fine. So the main thing is I want to violate that policy, so I'm going to click locally redundant storage. I'm not going to make any other changes. I'm going to click on review and create. And once it finished the validation, then I can go ahead and click on create. And then what I expect to happen is that it's going to fail. And the reason why it's going to fail is because it's going to say you're trying to deploy something. So let's go create it. So it looks as if it's going through, but it's not going to go through. So it's going to go, yep. So now it's submitting the deployment and it's going to fail. So just watch that, and at least I expect, there we go. So deployment failed. And you can see status forbidden. And if I go to the details, you'll see the details there. It says it was disallowed by policy, right? And it's like, hey, you're trying to deploy something. However, Sakofi, I do have, I believe, if I don't have storage account, if I have existing storage accounts that violates that policy, it's just going to flag them up to me and say, hey, you have this storage account that violates this policy, but it's not going to do anything.
All right. So with the creation of that resource, when you violate, does it tell you the specific policy that it triggered violation?
Yes, so it's going to. So that's a very, very good question, Sir Coffee. You know that's your security mind that's coming up. Where can I get the audit and stuff? So that's going to be like in the audit log. It may be a few minutes before that shows up. If I go to my subscription and if I go to the audit log, that's going to be there to say that was violated. So we'll talk about logging. The final, actually, I believe one of the final topics that we'll talk about will be monitoring, and we'll talk about logging in Azure. So we're going to actually break down monitoring in Azure in a way that I saw. You can see validate deployment failed, and you can see deny policy action. And if you click on it, it's gonna essentially expose my secret. It's gonna say this user with this email address from this IP address called this name tried to do this over here, and that failed over here. So it's going to actually dump out everything that I tried to do. Right? It's going to say, that's the policy that I violated. And what I was trying to do was that I was trying to create a storage account that was using locally redundant storage, and it's going to give the entire story over here. So very good question.
Quite impressive, yeah.
Yeah, it does that. So, we mentioned that for existing resources, it's just going to audit that. But like I should just show you in the demo, for new resources, it's actually going to stop, any violations from taking place. So let's move on very quickly and let's see other things. So what are some of the common use cases for Azure policy? Yeah, some are common use cases. So people can use that to define resource types that they want to allow. So for example, Sarkofi, we talked about people creating massive amount of resources with high SKU that's consuming a lot of budget. So you can essentially say, hey, you cannot create virtual machine with 416 CPUs, right? So you can do that.
Your thoughts. We got a question, so I'm just going to bring it out on the screen, and then you can have a look. All right, Dara is, making
I'll get you back, Dara. By the way, Dara has an amazing Twitch channel. By the way, it does amazing content on Twitch on C#. So if you're into development, just search for Dara Oladapo. You'll find amazing content. Please go ahead, sir. So is there a more non-JSON way of viewing this log? So the more non-JSON way is the way where it's going to give you like a summary here. But that's a very, very good question. So essentially it's going to give that to you here. However, what I've seen like tools like the Palo Alto Prisma Cloud, what they actually do is they normalize that. So when they give like a history of what's going on in your environment, they help you to normalize that in a nicer way. Right. So, but for the sake of just using just pure activity log, that essentially is going to give you the summary here. But if you want to actually see the full details, the only option is to go see the JSON at the moment, unfortunately.
Okay, so that's great. We got another question, so I'm just going to play that on the screen as quick as possible. So the policy is now attached to a particular subscription, and I believe that's the case, right?
Exactly. So that's the case, and I believe that actually that's the next thing that we're going to look at, which is where can we assign the policies. So we're going to look at that in a minute. But before we do that, so it's now assigned to the subscription. But before we do that, let's just quickly round up this by looking at the three components of Azure policy. So let's look very quickly at what are the components of Azure policy. So look at these components and it makes sense to you. Three components of Azure policy. We have a policy definition, which is what defines the configuration that we are assessing. We have a policy assignment, which is what defines the scope that we're assigning the policy. And we have a policy evaluation, which is the evaluation of
which is when the policy is actually going to be evaluated against the resources. So let's go have a look at this very, very quickly, and then we'll round up for today. So let's start first with policy definition. So policy definition is a JSON template that defines the configuration, assessment, and effects. And it's a classic if this then that definition. So what does this mean by classic if this then that? So what this means is if this condition happens, then apply this effect. So Sir Kofi, at the beginning of this lesson, of this live study, I told you that Azure policy has 7 different effects, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So here are the 7 effects that you have here. So we can apply a deny effect, an audit effect, an append effect. So this one is mainly used if you want to append like a configuration. So I can say, hey, if you violate this policy, I'm actually going to allow you to go through. I'm just going to append the configuration that you missed, right?
What about tags? Can
Yeah.
you enforce a tag?
And that's a good point, because the lab that Sir Kofi that you'll be giving people to do tomorrow will actually be they'll be doing this in their labs, where people will actually try to deploy a resource, and then Azure policy is going to look at it, and then they're going to use this append effect to append a tag to the resource before deploying it. So
okay, I got a question, just a real one,
yes.
quick one. Let me just throw that on the screen.
No problems. So let's see the question.
Can be taken to any text editor and work upon?
Yes, you can do that. So there are different ways you can pull out, like the activity log JSON. You can pull it out via API. Will probably be like the easiest way to pull it out. So you can stream it into like a storage account, and then pick it up as just normal JSON files in a storage account. So yeah, so you can take it to a text editor to work upon it. However, that's a bit like, a longer process. Why would you just pay for like a third-party service that that make your life easier? That's why we don't do everything open source. Open source is fun, but we don't do everything open source because it can make life complicated sometimes.
So when you say third-party, what sort of application are we looking at?
An example is the one that I've been mentioning, which is like the Prisma Cloud, Prisma Cloud, the CSPM solution of Prisma Cloud. Makes your life easier. So the reason why third-party services exist, Sir Kofi, is because if Microsoft, has solved all the problem there is to solve, then why do third-party solutions need to exist? Right. So Sir Kofi also works at a security organization. So the security organization that Sir Kofi works for, they make security products like firewalls and other stuff. So there are open source firewall stuff out there.
Yeah.
Right? But the thing is, it's very complicated to put them together and all that stuff. It's fun, but in an operationalized environment or a very, very highly scalable environment, it becomes difficult and stuff.
Right.
So you can see this effect. So you can see an effect. And even I have an effect that says, okay, disable that policy. And you can use this to essentially modify a configuration of a resource. So, and say if a resource violates this, so you can use this for existing resource. If a resource violates this policy, modify it to be compliant, right? So you can do that. So that is what an Azure policy looks like. So let's go have a look at this in more details. So here's an example of an Azure policy document. So we start with just the curly bracket, and then we start with and then next we have our if section and the then section. So we have the if, this condition, then this effect. So for example, in the if section, we're evaluating and saying if the resource is a virtual machine. So if the resource is microsoft.compute/virtual machine, if the resource is a virtual machine, and if the virtual machine's queue configuration is not in the list that I'm going to specify, so, and then you can use a condition essentially to tie all of them together. So if all of these conditions are met, then I want to deny you from applying that configuration. So in other words, what we're looking at here is we're saying if all of these conditions are met, what are the conditions? If the resource is a virtual machine and the SKU is not on the list of the allowed SKU that I've specified, deny it from being able to be deployed. So that's an example of what an Azure policy looks like in the backend. And you can create your own. You can essentially just go look in any Azure resource, look at the configuration of the resource, and just construct your own based on this. Just create an if section, create a then section, and say if this configuration is not equals to this, then apply any of those 7 effects that we saw.
All right.
So, but one of that thing about Azure policy is that it's very difficult to just have Azure policy to assign them individually. So what Microsoft have is they have something called policy initiative. So what policy initiative does, Kofi, is that it allows us to be able to group policies together and apply
Yeah.
them as one.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. So a good example of that is I can create a policy initiative and I can call it cost initiative. And any policy that has to do with cost reasons, so maybe policy to deny people from creating massive virtual machine sizes, deny VM sizes, I can put that as one of the policies in this cost initiative. I can create another policies that denies massive amount of SQL database sizes. So essentially, any policy that has to do with maintaining cost and budget, I can put them into a cost initiative. Then I can apply them at once. So instead of applying 100 different policies 100 times, group them together, apply them as one. So that's what initiative is about. It's about grouping policies together.
And when you say apply, are you applying this to a resource? Are you applying it to subscription? What are you applying it to?
Very, very good question, Sir Kofi, because that is the next point that we're going to, which is policy assignment. Where can we assign Azure policy? So here's where we can assign Azure policy. We can apply it to the management group level. The good thing about that is if we apply it at the management group level, it's going to be inherited by anything below the management group. So the way that we want to do this, Kofi, is all those top governance type policies for our organization, we apply them at the root management level. So for example, in our organization, for data residency and compliance reasons, we don't want data to leave the UK or Europe, right?
Yeah.
We can apply a policy at the top here that says deny deployment into any other Azure region apart from the UK regions and the Europe regions. So at the top, usually are assigned just like the more generic policies. And then as you go further down, you can allow the teams to apply their own more restrictive policies. So what you want to try to avoid to do is to lock things down again. We talked about governance, cloud governance earlier. You want to avoid locking things down too much at this level because that defeats the purpose of the cloud. Well, one of the purposes of the cloud, which is agility.
Got it.
Yeah. So we can apply it at the subscription level like I just did. We can also apply it at the resource group level. So those are the different levels that we can assign Azure policy. So we cannot assign directly to a single resource. We can only apply up to the resource group level.
Resource group level, all right.
Yeah. And the other thing that I mentioned here is that the policy and assignment are inherited by all child resources. If I apply it to the subscription, all the resources under that subscription will inherit that. If I apply it to a child management group, all the subscriptions in that child management group inherit that. And if I apply at the root management group level, all the subscriptions at the lower level inherit that.
Okay. But on the portal, is there a way to see if, let's say, a subscription or let's say a resource group has actually inherit, policies?
So I believe if you go to, so for example, I applied this at the subscription level, right?
Yeah.
The one I applied earlier. So let's go into a resource group of that subscription. So let's go have a quick look at that. So here's a resource group. And if I go under policies here, and if I go under assignments, so it's just going to show the scope that I've assigned it. So you can see it which scope this is assigned. So this is assigned at the subscription scope.
Okay.
Yeah. So let's bring this to a close and then we can stop for today. So here's the final part. So the final part is, let's go look at the other third part of Azure policy, which is the evaluation. So this is a part that I don't see many people talk a lot about, but I'm going to talk about it in this. And this is where we'll end. So what about Azure policy evaluation? How often are policies evaluated? So pay attention to this one because this is the end of everything today. So number one, if I take a new policy, Sir Kofi, and I assign a new policy to, let's say, the subscription, for the existing resources that I have, the policy will begin to, evaluation will start after 30 minutes. So let me show you a visual example of that. I take a policy and I apply it to the subscription. I have existing resources in this subscription. It does not mean that in the next 5 minutes I will see whether they are compliant or not. It actually takes a while. So what happens is after about 30 minutes, it's going to start the evaluation, and then I'm going to begin to see the resources come through.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. So just be aware that that's the case for existing resources. Give it like about 30 minutes before you begin to see the results. What about if I update this policy? So now I've applied this policy, Sakofi. So now I go to update this policy. When will they start reassessing these resources? It's the same time range. After 30 minutes, it's going to begin to reassess those resources.
Is it because it take a bit of time to propagate or what?
That's part of it, but to be honest, like part of it also, I'm not sure as to exactly the reason why. I'm sure that there will be like a technical explanation on the development side why that's not why that takes 30 minutes before you start evaluation. But I'll guess that's probably like part of it, right? So the propagation and all of that, right? So and also like just assessing resources, also that's like bunch of compute, and then depending on what you've got, yeah. So what about, let's look at other scenarios before we end today. So what about after a new resource is deployed to this scope? So Sakofi, what I'm saying is I have a resource here, I have my policy here, but I go to deploy a new resource, like a new Azure App Service. When will it start assessing this new resource against the policy that's already applied here? So that'll be after 15 minutes. So if I go to create a new resource under the scope, after about 15 minutes, the evaluation is going to start. However, the evaluation will not affect other resources. So it's not going to reassess all these existing resources. It's only going to assess the new resource that I deployed, in about 15 minutes. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And then finally, how often will it reassess all those? So the evaluation happens once every 24 hours. So once every 24 hours, it's actually going to go, we're going to reassess everything again. So just once every 24 hours. There is also an option that we can trigger an on-demand scan. So we can do this using command line tools. We can do this using API by making an API call. So we can trigger an on-demand scan, but that's not something that I believe that we can do from the portal yet, except I've missed out an announcement, but we can do it using API. So, but that's sort of like how evaluation happens. So it happens this way. So, Sakofi, that's like what we have for today. So that's what I have for today.
Amazing, amazing. I mean, I've learned a lot from this session, and I believe our audience have also learned a lot from this session. We thank you guys for joining this session, and we're looking forward that you continue to join our session. We do have one coming up tomorrow, and we hope that you guys will also join us. The lab will be tomorrow, won't be today, so bear in mind. So yeah, David, thank you so much for such an excitement session. I mean, looking at the comments, a lot of people are really thankful for this session. And so yeah, thank you very much.
No problems at all. Right. Thanks very much, everyone. Have a lovely
Thank you guys, and we'll see you guys tomorrow. All right.
See you. Cheers.
Bye. Bye-bye.